Hello, everyone. Dr. Mad here. Let's get mad about poetry. So, in this lesson, we're going to look at Storm on the Island, 1966, by Seamus Heaney. This is a poem about Ireland, its weather, and the strength of its people. Some people have also suggested that the whole poem is a metaphor for the political situation there. This is supported by the war terminology used in the poem and also by the fact that the first part of the title spells Stormont. So as you can see there, up to there, which is the name of the Parliament building in Northern Ireland. So there's Seamus Heaney, a great Irish poet. So Seamus Heaney, 1939 to 2013, born in Northern Ireland. His work is known for its description of Irish rural life. This means countryside and events in Irish history, as well as for its allusions to Irish myth. So this kind of goes with the point about the political situation. This means to refer to Irish myth. He received the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1995. After graduating from Queen's University, Belfast, Heaney taught secondary school for a year and then lectured in colleges and universities in Belfast and Dublin. He then became a professor. He wrote in a traditional style about a passing way of life, of domestic rural life in Northern Ireland. So this means to do with the home or the home country, if you like, and countryside. In the 1970s, he began to include such subjects as the violence in Northern Ireland and contemporary Irish experience, though he continued to view his subjects through a mythic and mystical filter. So notice that this date sort of contradicts what we've said because this poem was written in 1966. But the troubles in Ireland have a long history going way back decades. So the point can still be made, really. Okay, so here is a glossary for the poem. Please try to learn the words or at least read through them 2 or 3 times before you look at the poem. It will make your life a lot easier. The word stack can just mean a pile, but in the context of this poem, I think it means it's talking about bundles of hay, and stooks means bundles of grain. So I'm just pointing out some of the important words there. And here, for example, a lot of words to do with war. And these are the techniques that he uses. Okay, so for example, bombard. Okay, so I'm going to move on in 3 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay, so we're going to listen to an audio version of the poem and then we'll go through it.
We are prepared. We build our houses squat, sink walls in rock and roof them with good slate. This wizened earth has never troubled us with hay, so, as you see, there are no stacks or stooks that can be lost. Nor are there trees which might prove company when it blows full blast. You know what I mean. Leaves and branches can raise a tragic chorus in a gale, so that you listen to the thing you fear, forgetting that it pummels your house too. But there are no trees, no natural shelter. You might think that the sea is company, exploding comfortably down on the cliffs. But no, when it begins, the flung spray hits the very windows, spits like a tame cat turned savage. We just sit tight while wind dives and straves invisibly. Space is a salvo. We are bombarded with the empty air. Strange. It's a huge nothing that we fear.
Okay, a short poem. So this first bit is fairly straightforward. They are ready. And squat means wide and strong. Okay, so they make sure that their houses are ready for the storm, for the weather when it turns nasty. And they put the walls into rock, which is obviously the strongest foundation you can have. And they make sure that the slate tiles that they put on the roof are good as well. This word can be pronounced as wizened, as in the audio, or some people say wizened, means dried, shriveled up. And he's saying here that the earth is infertile, it doesn't grow things. Okay, but when he says it's never troubled us with hay, he's being sarcastic, because obviously you do want the earth to be fertile, all right? But in this case, it's not fertile, and so there are no bundles or bunches of hay. So stack, bundle of hay, or stook, bundle of grain. Okay, there's nothing grows there. So they're not going to lose anything when the wind comes. And there aren't any trees either. And here again he's being sarcastic, but also using personification. If there were trees and they fell over, they would be lying next to them, lying next to their houses, so they'd be like companions. But that's not going to happen either, even when the wind blows full blast. And then this is just a phrase, and he's saying that when it's windy, the leaves and the branches obviously become very noisy, don't they? And it's almost like they're singing in the wind. So gale is like a storm, just below a storm. And here again, we've got personification. So chorus means singing. So when the wind is blowing and the leaves and the branches are making this huge noise, rather in this case, not, because there aren't any trees. And if there were, you would hear that noise and you would forget that it's attacking, punching, personification, your house as well. All right, so this line is a bit confusing actually if you don't kind of tie it in with all these lines here. But you don't need to worry too much about this line. All right, we'll leave it to the next reading. But as he says, there are no trees and there's no natural shelter. So then you think, okay, maybe the sea will provide you with company. And here he's using not only personification, but also oxymoron, because exploding is like a negative word. It's tied to this war terminology, like the way bombs explode. But comfortable is a positive thing. So we've got an oxymoron here. So the sea is, the waves are crashing against the cliffs here. But he's saying that you might think the sea is company, but it's not, because when it becomes windy, when the gale comes, the spray, the water that comes up out of the waves, hits the windows of the houses and it spits. Yeah. So again, personification, and also there's a simile here. The water spits like a cat. Now be careful. Don't, if you, with poetry, you can't just stop at the lines. If you just say spits like a tame cat, that's a bit misleading. You need to carry on, turned savage. So it's like a nice little cat sitting there and suddenly it jumps at you, it attacks you. Okay, and that's what this water does. 1 minute it's calm and then suddenly it's attacking the windows. And when that happens, all they can do is sit tight, sit quietly and wait for it to go. And the wind dives and strafes. So this is the war terminology here in particular towards the end. So this is like the way aircraft, bomber aircraft attack. And strafe also means to attack widely. Here's a metaphor. Space is a salvo. Salvo is another word to attack by all kinds of means. And bombarded is another word for attack. Yeah, so it's a semantic field of war, but they're being attacked with the empty air, the space. So it's as though the attacks are coming out of nowhere. Because when the air is calm, you don't really see it. It's only when it's really windy, then you realize it's there. And then this last line can be a bit confusing as well, a bit like this line here. But the huge nothing is like the space. So when it's calm, it looks like nothing. But then when it turns violent, suddenly you realize that it can be fearful and destructive. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. It's a fairly tricky poem, but The basics of it are fairly straightforward. He's just describing how the weather can turn nasty in Ireland. And then obviously there's the second meaning, but we'll talk about that later. So AO1, to be able to read, understand, and respond to the poem using quotes and references. Loads of quotes there. You only need about 4. And these are all the techniques he uses. And I've given you the examples there. So please, by all means, pause the video here and check these and make sure you understand them. And then moving on. AO2, language, form, and structure, using techniques and terminology. So language means words and phrases. And then you have to talk about the effects of those phrases, thoughts, feelings, images, and the connotations of any words that you pick out, that you zoom in on. So these are some of the examples of words and phrases from the previous slide. In terms of form and structure, this poem does not have a specific form as such. It's not a specific type, but it is written in blank verse, which is unrhymed lines in iambic pentameter. At first glance, when you first look at it, it looks like a sonnet, but be careful, it's not. It has 19 lines instead of 14. However, the poem has a squat shape, perhaps to match the squat houses that they build. So remember, structure is mostly to do with how the content is organized. Sometimes it can be to do with the physical shape, and in this case, you can say something about the shape. Techniques and terminology. Heaney uses many techniques, but especially personification and a semantic field of war. So this means words from a given topic, in this case, war. And then in terms of context, AO3, you can talk about how this is a poem about Ireland, its weather and environment, and the strength of its people. Some people have also suggested that the whole poem is a metaphor for the political situation there. Okay, so you have now learnt more than enough to get a grade 4 or 5, depending on how you write your essay. Here is a quiz to test your understanding so far. Please pause the video here and answer these questions. Okay, I'm going to move on to the answer slide in 3 seconds. 3, 2, 1. So here are the answers. Please check your answers against these, and if you really struggled, you need to go back and listen again. Or if you want, you can carry on to the end and then go back. But if you really struggled, I would suggest you go back now. And then once you've mastered these questions, all you have to do is to add a bit more detail and convert them into flowing sentences and paragraphs. So for example, you might get a question like this. How does the poet present the power of nature in Storm on the Island? Compare with one other poem, which we're not going to do here, but you could compare with Stealing the Boat. So remember the prelude, how the weather suddenly turns nasty. It's very similar here. Or you can compare it to Exposure, which is a war poem, but it's about the weather in that case. And you might start something like this. The poet presents the power of nature by using a semantic field of war to show that the weather can be almost as destructive as war. The poem begins, we build our houses squat. Here, the poet uses the adjective squat to describe the kind of houses they build. This word means short and wide, which is even reflected in the physical look of the poem, especially if seen sideways. So notice for a grade 4 or 5, you don't need a lot. Brief introduction, a brief answer, short summary, 1 or 2 techniques, and then your point. And how you start, how you do your introduction and your first point will depend on the poem. Okay, I've tried to give you different examples in all these videos, but it's about giving the evidence, talking about the meanings and effects, talking about techniques, which in this case, even an adjective is a technique. This you can talk about later. So about 4 paragraphs like that, and an introduction and conclusion, and a bit more about the context would be more than enough to get a grade 4 or 5. If you're aiming higher, let's carry on. So let's look again now at these things here. So tone and mood. Starts off quite a stoic mood, stoic, S-T-O-I-C, meaning strong, uncomplaining, but then kind of becomes slightly fearful towards the end. And I would say the mood is the same. The mood that it's created is kind of matches the tone that the poet has. In terms of rhyme and rhythm, squat, state, as, stacks, there's no rhyming, but if you count the syllables, you will find most of them are about 10 syllables per line. So this is blank verse in iambic pentameter, 10 syllables per line. We sort of mentioned that earlier as well. In terms of language, I would say this line here, so just make sure that for the high grades, if you can make sure you understand this line by tying it to these previous lines here, that if you're too concentrated on the noise made by the leaves and the branches, you forget that it's attacking your house as well. And then this line, you could talk about how, on the one hand, he's saying, oh, it's a huge nothing, in the sense that it's coming out of air, which seems empty, nothing to start with. But actually, it's not a huge nothing because it is something. He's saying that when the weather turns violent, it does cause a lot of damage. So this is actually not quite true. So remember, for the high grades, it's about giving multiple interpretations and possibly giving your own opinion at the end, but you don't have to do that. It's more about how you are able to discuss this in nice, clear writing. So form, like I said, no specific form, but remember that rhyme and rhythm are also to do with form and structure. And in terms of structure, we sort of covered that when we talked about how the tone and mood changes from stoic to fearful. And in terms of physical structure, how this kind of looks quite squat, the poem. And with context, you can maybe talk about this semantic field of war and how that might tie to the political situation in Ireland. Okay, so moving on. Here is an advanced quiz. Please pause the video here and have a good go at these questions. If you're aiming for the higher grades, you need to be able to answer these questions. I'm going to move on to the answer slide in 3 seconds. 3, 2, 1. So please pause the video here and make sure that your answers are close. They don't have to be exactly the same. As long as you're on the right track and it makes sense what you've written, that's fine. So I'm going to move now on to the next slide in 3 seconds. 3, 2, 1. So now you've done more than enough for a grade 6 or 7. Such a paragraph might look like this. So up to here is the same as before. And then I've just added this bit here. Some people have suggested that the whole poem is a metaphor for the political situation in Ireland. And this here, up to here was the same as before, is the same as before. And I've added, the word also has connotations of strength in the sense that something that is squat cannot easily be knocked over. This could refer to how stoically, so remember this means strong, uncomplaining, the Irish people put up with the weather and with the political situation. So about 5 or 6 paragraphs like that, plus an introduction and conclusion, and a bit more context, would be more than enough to get you a grade 6 or 7. And by the way, I've kind of packed this in so that I can get it into all into one slide. So my idea is for grade 8 or 9. Remember, with this, it's more about making sure your whole essay flows nicely from beginning to middle to end. But I think these 2 lines here, if you can discuss these in detail, various interpretations, that would be grade 8, 9 material. If you can discuss the semantic field of war, why the poet might have used those words, how they tie in to the political situation interpretation, and that kind of ties into the contextual point here, more on the extended metaphor and the political situation in Ireland, how the whole poem can be seen as an extended metaphor. Okay, so that's that. And then as a final task, once you've thought about all that, you could complete the essay we've started. How does the poet present the power of nature in Storm on the Island? And that's it. I hope you found that video useful. If so, please do subscribe and tell all your friends about it. And I will see you in the next video, the next poem.